Frank Whitaker sat at the edge of his recliner, a jar of pickles in his hand and a grimace on his face. His fingers, once steady enough to solder tiny circuits and coax dying radios back to life, now trembled slightly, refusing to grip with the strength he once took for granted. The jar didn't budge. He gave it another twist, using a rubber grip pad this time, but the lid remained stubborn. On the television behind him, a voice was speaking, rich and direct, but Frank wasn't listening, not yet. The sound was background static, just like most things these days, far away, for someone else, too fast, too loud. He sighed, setting the jar on the coffee table next to yesterday's paper and a stained coffee mug. His house was quiet, too quiet. The only other sound was the faint wheeze of the radiator and the occasional creak from the upstairs hallway, like the house itself was settling into old age alongside him. The kitchen light flickered once. A thunderstorm was rolling in. He reached for the remote to turn off the television, but the voice caught him. It was Elon Musk. Not in a commercial, but in something live, something urgent. The screen showed a man, young, in a wheelchair, blinking rapidly, then lifting a finger, then a hand. The crowd gasped. Elon stood beside him, arms folded, explaining calmly that the man had been paralyzed, completely immobile, and was now moving through a Neuralink interface, his brain talking directly to his body. The mind is a frontier, Elon was saying. And we are just beginning to map it. For the first time, the mind is no longer limited by the body's failures. Age, injury, these are challenges, not endpoints. The only real limit is the one you stop fighting. Frank stared at the screen. For a moment, he forgot the jar, forgot the ache in his knees, forgot the silence of the house. That sentence hit him like a bolt to the chest. The only real limit is the one you stop fighting. He leaned forward slightly. The camera panned over the audience, young tech entrepreneurs, scientists, some in suits, others in hoodies. He didn't belong in that world. Hadn't for decades. But something about that moment, the man moving his hand again, the room erupting in applause, cut through the rust on his heart. What if there was still something he hadn't finished? He reached for the remote, turned up the volume. Elon was now answering a question from the crowd. A young woman asked about memory loss, Alzheimer's, brain plasticity in older adults. We don't believe aging means decline, Elon said. We believe aging means untapped experience. And we need minds that have lived through problems before, minds that still know how to build, repair, teach, guide. This isn't just about youth. This is about capability. Frank's fingers were still resting on the remote. He didn't even realize he was holding his breath. The man on the screen, his eyes were wet with tears, his fingers still twitching, looked straight ahead. I thought I'd be stuck forever, he said quietly. Now I feel like I might be able to live again. Frank blinked, and his eyes began to sting. He hadn't cried in years. Not since Susan's funeral. Not since Rebecca stopped calling. Not since he gave up on his last project, the arm, the prototype he once swore he'd finish. He turned off the TV, but the words echoed. Not the science. Not the hardware. The idea. The spark. He stood up slowly, joints protesting, and walked to the kitchen. He grabbed the pickle jar again, planted his feet, gritted his teeth, and twisted. Nothing. He growled, louder than he expected, and slammed the jar down on the counter. The sound startled him. His hands were shaking harder now. Stupid, he muttered. Damn stupid. But he didn't walk away. He didn't sit back down. He stared at the jar like it had insulted him personally. Then, without knowing why, he turned and walked down to the basement. The lights flickered as he opened the door, the air growing cooler with each creaking step downward. He hadn't been down here in weeks. Maybe months. The workbench was dusty, covered with papers, wires, a cracked soldering iron, and a broken wall clock that still read 3:17. Shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes labeled in faded Sharpie, gears, spare motors, old tools, ideas. He stood in front of one labeled Dreams, a joke from years ago. He'd meant to finish something. He didn't remember what. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on a small wooden box under the bench. He pulled it out, coughing as dust rose into the air. Inside was a tangle of wires and plastic casing, the skeleton of a robotic glove he'd started building with Rebecca back when she was little. She used to call it the magic hand. They worked on it every Saturday until she was 12, when sports and friends pulled her away. He tried to finish it alone, but something broke, inside him more than the glove, and he left it half-finished. Like everything else. But now, as he held it, something pulsed in his chest. Not excitement. Not hope, exactly. Just interest. A flicker. He sat down at the bench, the wood creaking beneath him. Carefully, he laid the glove on a cloth, picked up a small screwdriver, and began to open its casing. He wasn't sure what he was doing. Wasn't sure if the part still worked. But his hands, still trembling, knew where to go. They remembered. Muscle memory, they called it. His fingers danced again. Slower, clumsier, but dancing. Somewhere upstairs, the TV still played, now an after-show panel about Neuralink's potential. But down here, in the cool dark of his basement, Frank Whitaker was rewiring something far more important than circuitry. He was rewiring belief. There was a question he hadn't asked himself in a long time. It lingered now, heavy in the silence. What if everything I believed about getting old was wrong? He whispered it aloud, startled by the sound of his own voice. He set down the screwdriver and looked at the glove. He hadn't felt this awake in years. Not since the accident. Not since Rebecca left. Not since he started thinking of himself as someone who used to be something. Outside, thunder rumbled softly. Rain began to tap the windows, a gentle percussion. Frank wiped his brow and leaned closer to the glove. The circuits were old, but maybe usable. Maybe. If he could get it working, maybe Tommy from down the street, who struggled with hand movement after his deployment, could use it. Maybe someone else could. Maybe he could still build something that mattered. That night, as the storm rolled through the town and the world above settled into dreams, Frank Whitaker did not sleep. He stayed in the basement until dawn, a soldering iron warming in his hand, his eyes lit not by ambition, but by something older and deeper, purpose. And somewhere, far away on a stage under bright lights, Elon Musk's words still echoed in the back of his mind, refusing to fade. The only real limit is the one you stop fighting. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The smell hit him first, motor oil, metal dust, and the faint tang of old electrical burn. It clung to the basement air like a memory that refused to leave, and for Frank Whitaker, it was as familiar as his own reflection. Sitting at the workbench under the weak light of a single hanging bulb, he stared at the half-assembled glove and felt something between fear and reverence. He hadn't touched a circuit in years. His fingers moved slowly now, but not without knowledge. They remembered solder joints, resistor codes, voltage drops. The tactile rhythm of building. Of repairing. But this wasn't just about wires and motors. This was about something deeper. As he moved an old magnifying glass into position, he heard another sound echo in his head, not Elon Musk's voice, but his own. Younger. Clearer. He was 29, standing in the old workshop behind the radio store, holding up a hand-built signal booster and laughing. This thing could power a ham signal from here to Michigan, he'd bragged to his friend Charlie, who nodded with mock amazement. Yeah. When you gonna start powering real money, Frank? Charlie had teased. Dreaming doesn't pay the mortgage. But dreaming had been all Frank had. He wasn't like the other guys from school who got jobs in banks or factories or went straight into the military. He liked building things, radios, transmitters, old TVs with tubes the size of soda cans. He liked solving puzzles no one else could see. People used to bring their broken gadgets to him with that defeated shrug. It's probably dead, but can you try? And he usually could. Usually did. That was back when he felt useful. Before everything slowed. Before the customers dwindled. Before digital parts replaced everything he knew. Before Susan's last sigh in that hospital room. Before Rebecca stopped returning his calls. He hadn't told anyone about the moment that changed things. The real one. Not some grand dramatic gesture, but something simple. He had dropped a small capacitor. That was all. Dropped it. Couldn't find it on the floor. Couldn't bend to reach it. He just sat there and stared at the empty space where it should have been, the silence around him louder than any machine, and realized he hadn't felt young in a long, long time. That was the day he packed everything up. Taped up the boxes. Wrote "Dreams" on one. Closed the door to the basement and didn't open it again. Until now. Until Musk's voice sliced through the silence like a hot wire. Until that veteran lifted his hand again. Until Frank saw someone come back from the place he'd quietly accepted as permanent. And now, sitting in front of his old robotic glove, Frank wasn't sure what he was looking at. A relic? A failure? Or something still unfinished? The glove had been Rebecca's favorite. She was 9 when they started building it. He remembered how her face lit up when he told her they could make something that could move fingers without a person even touching them, just by detecting muscle signals. Like a robot hand that reads your mind, she asked, eyes wide. Kinda, he said, smiling. Except it reads your wrist. But close enough. She had drawn pictures of it in crayon, red and gold, like Iron Man called it, the helper. And for a while, they had something special. Saturday mornings in the basement, her voice chirping with questions, wires tangled like spaghetti, old music playing on the radio. She held wires while he soldered. He explained circuits like bedtime stories. Electricity wants to go home, he told her once. It's just trying to get back to ground. Like we all are. That glove was supposed to be finished by her 12th birthday. But then middle school happened. Soccer practices. Friends. Sleepovers. She started showing up late. Then not at all. Sorry, Dad, I forgot, she'd say, not meeting his eyes. And then came high school, and the fights. The tension. Her saying she wanted to study business, not engineering. Him calling her ungrateful. Her calling him stuck. It got worse after Susan passed. The grief made him sharp. Cold. They argued about everything. He said things he shouldn't have. She left for college and didn't look back. That was 12 years ago. A birthday card came the first year. Then nothing. Frank hadn't told anyone about the box he kept in the attic with all her drawings, her trophies, the photo of them at the science fair holding a cardboard display board that read, Signal-activated hand assist. They won second place. He still had the ribbon. And now, all these years later, he was staring at the glove like it might talk to him. He picked up a multimeter, turned the dial slowly, tested the connection points. Most were corroded. A few sparked faintly. The sensors were shot. The wires brittle. He'd need to replace nearly everything. But the frame, plastic with steel inserts, was still strong. So was the core design. Frank scratched his chin. He still had some servos in the closet. He could print a new flex sensor at the library, if he could remember how to use the damn software. And maybe Tommy from down the street could help with the 3D files. Tommy had served 2 tours. Came home with a cane and a twitch in his left hand. Frank had fixed his lawnmower once, and since then they shared the occasional conversation, usually about football or car troubles, but maybe this was something bigger. Something real. He stood up stiffly and shuffled to the far side of the basement where a filing cabinet stood rusted shut. After a few grunts, he wrenched it open and pulled out a battered notebook. The front read, "Ideas worth finishing." He hadn't opened it in years. The pages were yellowed, but the sketches were still clear. There were diagrams of signal paths, notes on muscle detection, lists of parts to order. On the back cover was a sticky note, faded almost to white. In Rebecca's handwriting, "You're the smartest person I know. Don't stop." Frank closed the book and stared into the middle distance. Something inside him cracked. Not like breaking, but like ice melting. Slow. Quiet. But definite. Upstairs, the storm outside had passed. The moonlight filtered in through a small basement window, casting pale shadows over the workbench. Frank took a breath. Deep. Shaky. But fuller than before. He returned to the glove, tightened a few screws, tested the frame. It felt like greeting an old friend. The house remained silent. No one knew what he was doing. No one expected anything. And maybe that was the gift. No eyes. No deadlines. Just him and the question, could he still do it? Did any of it still matter? Elon Musk's voice drifted back into his mind, not the quote from the broadcast, but an older one he remembered reading once in an article. When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds aren't in your favor. Frank nodded to himself. The odds weren't good. His hands weren't steady. His mind wasn't fast. The tech had changed. The world had moved on. But the thing inside him, the part that wanted to build, to create, to connect, that part hadn't died. It had just been waiting. Waiting for a reason. Waiting for a spark. Waiting for someone to say, "You're not done yet." And maybe that someone didn't have to be a person. Maybe it could be a voice on a screen, a memory in a notebook, a child's drawing in a dusty file. Maybe the permission to begin again didn't come from the world. Maybe it came from within. Frank reached across the bench, grabbed a pencil, and wrote a date in the notebook's margin, August 28, 2025. Under it, he wrote one word. Restart. He stood, knees cracking, and flipped the light switch. The bulb flickered, then died. Darkness folded over the basement, but Frank didn't mind. His steps back up the stairs were slow, but not heavy. Something was waiting for him tomorrow. Not an answer. Not a miracle. Just a beginning. And that was more than he'd had in years. Frank stood at the top of the basement stairs, staring down into the dim silence as if it were a cave full of ghosts. The morning light was leaking through the narrow kitchen window, casting long gray streaks across the linoleum. Coffee was brewing in the corner, but he hadn't taken a sip. He just stood there, hand resting on the doorframe, listening to the house breathe. It had been 2 days since he first picked up the glove, since the broadcast, since Musk's words had lit that fuse in the quiet places of his mind, and something was shifting. Not just in the work, but in him. He no longer woke up and shuffled straight to the recliner with his knees aching and his heart already tired. He still ached, but the tired felt different now. Like anticipation. Like the kind of tired that meant you'd done something. He walked slowly back down the stairs, the wood groaning under his feet. This time, he flicked on the main basement light and stood at the center of the room, hands on his hips, surveying the space like a man who just inherited a kingdom of forgotten treasures. The shelves were still there, lining every wall. Metal. Rusted. Heavy. Each one sagging slightly in the middle from the weight of what he used to be. Boxes stacked 3 high. Labels curling. A few had fallen over, spilling contents across the floor in patterns that looked like stories interrupted mid-sentence. He walked to the far shelf, the one he hadn't touched since Susan died. His hand brushed across the boxes as he passed, relays, signal chips, old PCBs, then stopped at the one marked in his own scrawled handwriting, ideas. He crouched down slowly, his knees popping, and lifted the lid. Inside were plastic bags full of small motors, some used, some new, all carefully sorted and numbered. Underneath that was a manila folder filled with sketches. Some done in ballpoint pen on graph paper, others scribbled on napkins, envelopes, or the backs of bills. Each one showed a version of something he'd started: wearable tech, balance assistance devices, even an early idea for a voice-activated lamp. All unfinished. All abandoned. He reached deeper, fingers brushing the bottom of the box, and pulled out a small wooden plaque. It was dusty, but he recognized it immediately. The second-place ribbon from the science fair he and Rebecca had entered together. The ribbon was still clipped to the plaque, though faded and curled at the edges. He stared at it for a long time. The memory played in his head like a reel-to-reel tape from one of his old film projectors. The gymnasium had been crowded, full of kids with baking soda volcanoes and solar system dioramas. Their booth had been small, their design crude, a glove that lit up an LED when you flexed your wrist, but they'd explained it so well. Rebecca had stood proudly, talking to the judges, eyes glowing with that innocent fire only kids have before the world starts telling them what they can't do. When they announced their name for second place, she squealed and hugged him so tight he almost dropped the plaque. That night, she called him a genius. He never told her that hearing those words from her meant more than any patent ever would have. But that was a long time ago. Years. Lifetimes. Somewhere between then and now, he'd stopped believing he could finish anything. Stopped believing anyone was even watching. He looked up from the plaque and scanned the shelf above. That one was labeled, Abandoned Projects. The words hit harder than he expected. He pulled out a dusty binder and flipped it open. Inside were blueprints for a foot pedal designed to help stroke victims regain balance through subtle resistance training. He remembered building a prototype. It was still in the garage, buried behind the snow blower. Another folder showed an idea for a modular cane with attachable tools, light, magnifier, GPS. A walking stick for the tech age. He laughed bitterly. He'd sketched that in 2009. Way before anyone thought about smart anything. He'd even reached out to a few companies. No response. Just silence. After a while, that silence grew into a wall. And he stopped trying to climb over it. Frank set the binder down and leaned on the workbench, staring at the glove. It was still there, right where he'd left it. Cleaned, repaired, open like a hand waiting to be filled. He felt the itch again, that pull in his chest. He wasn't sure what the end goal was anymore. It wasn't about money. Or recognition. Or proving he was still relevant. It was about remembering what it felt like to matter. Even if just to himself. He reached for his phone and opened the browser. Typing slowly, he searched for affordable muscle sensors for prosthetic glove. The results came fast. Faster than he expected. There were open-source projects now, forums, videos, YouTube tutorials by kids half his age explaining how to make EMG sensors from scratch. He clicked one. A teenager with dyed hair and a lab coat was grinning into the camera. Welcome to the future, folks. You don't need a degree to change the world. Just curiosity and a soldering iron. Frank smirked. That used to be him. That used to be the whole game. Curiosity and a soldering iron. He bookmarked the page and made a mental list. He'd need sensors, replacement servos, a microcontroller, and a 3D printed mount for the wrist module. The printer at the local library could handle it, if he remembered how to use the damn software. Maybe someone there could help. Maybe Tommy. Maybe not. Either way, it was doable. For the first time in a long time, he felt like the project wasn't impossible. Just unfamiliar. And unfamiliar was manageable. He grabbed a pad of sticky notes from the drawer and began writing out tasks. Not big ones. Just small, focused steps. Order sensors. Find 3D file for mount. Dust off printer. Fix soldering iron. He stuck them in a line across the workbench, like breadcrumbs leading out of the woods. Each note felt like a breath of air in his lungs. Purpose wasn't a lightning strike. It was a series of tiny choices made one after another, even when no one else was watching. Especially then. The house remained quiet, but it no longer felt heavy. Just still. Like it was listening. He moved back to the shelf and began pulling more boxes down. Voice modules. Battery packs. Miscellaneous sensors. Each one held something he had once believed in. Tools. Potential. Versions of himself. He stacked the boxes on the floor and opened them one by one, wiping dust from old boards, testing buttons, sorting components. Hours passed. The light in the basement changed as the sun moved across the sky. Somewhere upstairs, the coffee had gone cold. His knees ached. His back groaned. But his hands were alive. He found an old Arduino board, still sealed in plastic, and smiled. Forgot he even had that. He plugged it into his laptop, updated the software, and ran a quick test. The tiny green light blinked to life. Like it had just been waiting. At some point, his phone buzzed. A notification from an old Reddit account he hadn't used in years. He'd posted once in a DIY forum about his balance pedal design. Someone had replied. "Hey, this is a great idea, did you ever finish it?" Frank stared at the screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He started typing, "No, I never finished. But I think I'm about to start again." He hit send. Then he looked around the basement, the mess, the notes, the gloves, the dust now disturbed. He'd barely scratched the surface. So much work ahead. But also, something better. He felt it now. A stirring in the chest. A flicker behind the eyes. He wasn't just revisiting the past. He was re-entering the present. Rejoining the world. Even if just from this little corner of it. And as the shadows lengthened across the concrete floor, Frank did something he hadn't done in years. He reached for his radio, dusted it off, and tuned it to the local AM frequency. Static. Then music. Old jazz. The kind Susan used to dance to in the kitchen. The glove sat beside him, silent but waiting. Frank picked up a screwdriver and got back to work. Tomorrow, he'd go to the library. Maybe even reach out to Tommy. Maybe even text Rebecca. But for now, the sound of jazz and the smell of solder filled the basement like prayers rising from a quiet chapel. And Frank Whitaker, 68, tired but no longer retreating, built something old into something new, surrounded by the ghosts of dreams he was finally ready to finish. Frank stood outside the library, staring up at the same brick facade he'd passed 1,000 times over the years without a second thought. It hadn't changed much. A little more ivy creeping across the sides, a newer bike rack out front, a sign in the window advertising a 3D printing workshop. He hesitated, holding his breath like he was about to walk into another world. In a way, he was. He hadn't stepped foot inside since Susan passed. She used to drag him here every Saturday, said a man who stopped reading was a man who stopped growing. He used to roll his eyes and pretend he was just there to check the wiring on the ancient computers, but really, he liked watching her get lost in the books. Now, it was him trying not to get lost in the past. The glass doors hissed open, and the cool air inside smelled like old paper and plastic. A young man behind the front desk looked up and gave a polite nod. Frank returned it and shuffled past the reading area toward the back, where he remembered seeing the Tech Commons sign once, years ago. The space had changed. Rows of public computers lined one side, and on the far wall sat a pair of 3D printers behind a glass partition, humming softly like they were alive. A couple of college-age kids leaned over a laptop, fiddling with a CAD file, while another worked on a small drone, its rotors spread like dragonfly wings. Frank stood there a moment too long, unsure if he looked curious or completely lost. One of the students noticed. "Need help with something?" the boy asked, friendly but cautious, like he wasn't sure if Frank was going to ask about books or complain about noise. "Yeah," Frank said, voice rough from disuse. "I'm trying to get a file printed. I've got a design. Just haven't done this in a while." "No problem," the kid replied, motioning him over. "What kind of design?" Frank hesitated. He pulled out a crumpled printout of a wrist mount he'd found online, a simple sensor housing that could attach to the top of the glove. "It's for a robotics glove," he said. "Adaptive assistive tech, low voltage. I'm rebuilding a prototype I started a while ago." The student's eyebrows rose. "That's cool. Like an exoskeleton glove?" "Sort of. More like a muscle signal reading glove. For folks with limited hand mobility." "Whoa. You designing it yourself?" "The base is mine," Frank said, a little more confidently. "But I'm borrowing the housing. No point reinventing the wheel if someone else already made the casing printable." "Totally. Here, I'll show you how to set it up." Frank followed him to the console, and for the next half hour, they worked through the setup process. The kid, Ben, as he eventually introduced himself, walked him through slicing the file, adjusting layer height, infill percentage, print speed. Frank nodded along, absorbing it all. He felt clumsy, slow, like trying to ice skate after 20 years off the ice, but the language of creation was still buried somewhere inside him. It just needed coaxing. As the printer started its first pass, laying down a thin bead of filament, Frank stepped back and watched the machine work. There was something hypnotic about it. Precise. Patient. It reminded him of the first time he watched a CNC machine in a friend's garage, long before such things were affordable. The future used to look like this, impossible, fast, out of reach. Now it was sitting behind glass in the local library. He suddenly felt the weight of time on his shoulders again, not in a bitter way, but in a curious one. So much had changed. So much had become possible. What had he missed while he was sitting still? After thanking Ben and scribbling a few notes, Frank walked back to the main lobby, passing shelves of biographies and novels. On impulse, he stopped at the front desk. "You still have public internet access?" he asked. "Of course," the librarian said. "Just sign in at any open station." Frank nodded and made his way to a free terminal. He sat down slowly, pulled out his notebook, and typed into the search bar, "How to reconnect with an estranged daughter." The results came fast. Too fast. Articles, forums, stories. Some hopeful, others heartbreaking. He clicked on a Reddit thread titled, "I haven't spoken to my daughter in 12 years. Is it too late?" He read quietly. The answers varied. Some said yes. Some said no. Some said try anyway. One line caught him off guard, "You're not reaching out to fix the past. You're reaching out to show them you're still here." He sat back in the chair and stared at the screen. That was it, wasn't it? He didn't want to explain everything. He just wanted her to know he hadn't disappeared. That he still remembered the science fair. The Saturdays in the basement. Her crayon drawings on the fridge. He opened his email. Her address was still saved in the contacts. He clicked it open, stared at the blank message. His hands hovered over the keyboard. "What do you say after 12 years of silence?" He typed, "Hi Rebecca. I know it's been a long time, and I don't expect a reply. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything I said, and everything I didn't say. I'm working on something right now, an old project of ours, actually. I'm not writing to ask anything. Just to let you know I'm still here. And I still think about you every day. He read it twice. Deleted one sentence. Rewrote another. Then he hit send. No ceremony. Just breath. The kind you take when you jump into cold water and hope it doesn't steal the air from your lungs. He closed the browser and stood, heart pounding in his chest like it was trying to punch its way out. It wasn't bravery, really. It was something quieter. Something closer to surrender. Surrendering to the truth that time doesn't wait, and neither should we. Back at the printer, the housing was nearly done. Ben gave him a thumbs up. Give it 20 more minutes, he said. You want a coffee? Frank blinked. They got coffee here. Best vending machine brew in town, Ben joked. Frank chuckled. Sure. Why not? They sat at a small table by the window, 2 paper cups steaming between them. Outside, people passed with strollers, backpacks, earbuds. The world didn't care who he used to be. It didn't owe him a second chance. But maybe that was the point. You didn't wait for permission to live again. You just did it. So what's the glove for? Ben asked. Frank thought for a moment. It started as something for my daughter and me. A learning thing. Then it turned into an idea to help people with motor control issues. Now it's unfinished business. Ben nodded. That's a good reason. They didn't speak for a while after that. Just sipped their coffee and listened to the low hum of the machines behind the glass. When the printer finished, Frank carefully removed the mount and inspected it. It was clean. Light. Functional. It felt like holding a piece of progress. Thanks, he said. You saved me about 3 weeks of YouTube tutorials. Anytime, Ben said. Let me know how it goes. Honestly, it's kind of inspiring. Most people just print phone holders or toys. Frank smiled. This one's for something that matters. He left the library that afternoon with more than just a printed part. He left with momentum. With the email sent. With the next breadcrumb in hand. When he got home, he placed the mount on the glove and turned on his old soldering iron. It hissed slightly, then glowed orange. He held the wire steady, made the connection, then stepped back. The glove was slowly becoming real again. The project was coming back to life. So was he. Somewhere in his inbox, a message waited to be opened. Or maybe not. Maybe she'd never reply. But that wasn't the point. He'd taken the step. He'd made the connection. And now, as the sun set over the quiet town and the smell of hot metal filled the air, Frank Whitaker, aging, aching, and still unfinished, looked at his work and whispered aloud, "It's not too late." Because some stories don't end. They just wait. For someone brave enough to start them again. Frank woke before the sun. Not because of pain, which usually nudged him awake around 5, but because he was already thinking about wires. Somewhere between dreaming and waking, he had started mentally tracing the glove's new signal path. How the flex sensor would trigger the servo, how the microcontroller would modulate input lag, how to make it feel like something real, something useful, not just a half-finished science fair trick. He sat up slowly, rubbing his knees, and glanced at the small laptop glowing on the workbench from the night before. The screensaver was still looping, tiny constellations forming and fading. It felt right. Like the kind of pattern Susan used to say reminded her of space, of possibility. Frank shuffled to the kitchen, brewed a cup of strong coffee, and skipped breakfast. He didn't need it today. The hunger in him wasn't for food. It was for the next line of code, the next circuit to close. He carried the cup to the basement, careful on the stairs, careful like someone carrying purpose instead of just caffeine. The glove waited on the bench, patient as always. Its frame looked better with the new wrist housing attached. Not elegant, but clean. Functional. Frank could see the path forward. The flex sensor, soldered now to the input node. The EMG patch, still in testing, but viable. The servo motor's rotation calibrated to a 60-degree range, enough for a hand to close around a doorknob or a coffee mug. Not a full grip, but more than zero. And for someone who had lost mobility, more than zero could feel like winning the lottery. He opened his notebook and checked the list. One by one, he had started crossing things off. Not like a man finishing chores, but like someone unlocking doors. Each check mark meant the future had come one step closer to something better. And now there was only one item left, first test. Frank stared at it, pencil hovering, then dropped it and exhaled slowly. Testing meant risk. Risk meant possible failure. And failure meant, what? Embarrassment? Frustration? Proof that he was, as he sometimes feared late at night, too old for this kind of thing now. Too slow, too dated, too irrelevant. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was going back upstairs and watching the rest of his life fade into reruns and aches. So he stood, stretched, and powered on the glove. The light blinked, green. A good start. The motor made a faint hum, a hopeful sound. He attached the EMG sensor patch to his forearm, right where the signal would be strongest. It wasn't perfect, not calibrated for everyone, but it was a start. He flexed his wrist. Nothing. He adjusted the patch, tweaked the signal amplifier, increased the gain slightly, tried again. Still nothing. The green light flickered, then held steady. A reading was coming through, but no movement. Come on, Frank muttered, half to the glove, half to himself. Don't go quiet now. He rechecked the wiring. Ground wire was good. Code was uploaded. The servo should have responded. He tapped a few keys, adjusted the delay in the script, uploaded again. Held his breath. Flexed. And then, it moved. Just a little. The fingers jerked slightly forward, like a twitch. Frank blinked, startled by how small and yet monumental the movement was. You saw that? He said aloud, laughing to no one. That's real. He flexed again, this time smoother, and the fingers of the glove followed, slow, imperfect, hesitant, but real. The hand moved. His design worked. Not flawlessly, not elegantly, but functionally. It was a beginning. He sank into the stool and exhaled, suddenly aware of how tight his chest had been. For the first time in over a decade, something he had built responded to his command. It was like seeing color after a long gray winter. He imagined someone else wearing it, Tommy, maybe, or the veteran from the Neuralink broadcast. Someone whose hand had betrayed them. He imagined them reaching for a fork. A phone. A doorknob. And he imagined the expression on their face when the glove responded. That image brought tears to his eyes. Not the dramatic kind. Just the quiet pooling of gratitude and exhaustion that comes when something long dormant begins to bloom again. He let it sit there for a moment, just breathing. The machine. The motion. The meaning. His laptop dinged, a notification. He turned toward the screen. The subject line said, Hi Rebecca. He froze. The room fell silent. Even the ticking of the old basement clock seemed to pause. His finger hovered over the mouse. He clicked. The email was short. 4 lines. Hi Dad. I don't really know what to say. I got your message. Thank you for sending it. I'm not ready to talk much yet, but I'm glad to know you're okay. I'm glad you're building again. Frank stared at the words. Not forgiveness. Not a reunion. But something. A line thrown across the silence. His hands shook a little as he reached for the keyboard. He typed, "That's more than I hoped for. I'm not looking for anything, just wanted to let you know I'm still here, and that I never stopped thinking about you. Building again helps. Maybe someday I can show you." He hit send before he could second guess it. Then he leaned back and closed his eyes. One movement from the glove. One message from his daughter. And suddenly, everything that felt impossible yesterday seemed quietly within reach. Upstairs, the mail slot clattered. He climbed the stairs, still light on his feet, and collected the small stack of envelopes, mostly junk. But among them was a slim padded envelope, return address from a local veterans rehab clinic. His eyebrows lifted. He opened it. Inside was a hand-typed letter on simple paper, and a photo. The letter read, "Mr. Whitaker, I saw your reply in the DIY forum about your balance pedal idea. I'm a rehab therapist working with a few patients who struggle with proprioception post-stroke. I'd love to learn more about your concept. Attached is a photo of one of my patients, Joseph. He's made progress, but we're always looking for new tools. Hope to hear from you soon." The photo showed a thin man with white hair and kind eyes standing between parallel bars, gripping tightly, smiling faintly. Frank ran a thumb across the photo, and for the first time, he truly felt it. The intersection between what he could build and what people still needed. He looked back at the glove. Then down at the old notebook beside it. The cover now bore a new sticky note, fresh from that morning. It read, "Who else can this help?" That question changed everything. This wasn't about him anymore. Not just about finishing for pride or even redemption. It was about usefulness. Legacy. Forward momentum. That afternoon, Frank spent 6 hours revising the code, testing servo responsiveness, tweaking input sensitivity. He added labels to the board, drafted a schematic, and recorded a short video demo, his hand flexing, the glove responding. Simple. Direct. No flash. Just proof of life. He uploaded it to the same DIY forum, attaching it to the original thread. Title, Prototype Progress, Adaptive Glove for Assisted Grip. He included a note, still refining, but wanted to show early proof. Designed for ease of use and low-cost assembly. Open to feedback. If this helps even one person, it's worth it. He hit publish and closed the laptop. Then he sat in the basement, surrounded by circuits and cables, and listened. To the silence. To the hum of the soldering iron. To the sound of a man who had once believed he was done, now realizing he had only just begun. The light in the basement dimmed as the sun set behind the house. Frank didn't turn on a lamp. He didn't need to. There was already enough light coming from inside. Frank didn't expect the flood. He didn't even hear the notifications at first. His laptop had gone into sleep mode, and he was too focused on fine-tuning the glove's finger articulation to notice. But when he finally sat down, wiping his hands on an old towel and sipping cold coffee, he tapped the spacebar and blinked. 42 new messages. Comments. Replies. One private message after another. The DIY forum thread had gone semi-viral. Not internet-famous viral, not news headline viral. But enough that fellow builders, caregivers, therapists, even one occupational tech from Iowa, had flooded the thread with encouragement, suggestions, and questions. This is amazing. My dad had a stroke last year. He could use something like this. Any chance you're going to open source the plans? Frank sat there, stunned. He read each comment slowly, like opening letters from a world he thought had forgotten people like him. People who built for the sake of building. People who believed tools could change lives. His hands trembled slightly, not from fatigue, but from something deeper. The kind of awe you feel when the world says, softly but clearly, you still matter. He clicked through the messages. Some offered technical suggestions: replace the servo with a linear actuator for smoother grip, use a more responsive sensor array, move the controller to the forearm for better weight distribution. Good advice, most of it. A few messages came from people who just wanted to talk. One man said he'd lost his wife last year and was trying to find purpose again through volunteer engineering. Another was a woman in her 70s who tinkered with Raspberry Pi projects and had always wanted to build assistive tech but never had the confidence. "Your post gave me courage," she wrote. Frank read that line 3 times. Courage. From a shaky video taken in his basement, with a prototype held together by zip ties and hope. He responded to each message, slowly, carefully. Not as a tech celebrity or a guru, but as Frank. A man who finally showed up again. A man who was rebuilding his life one servo at a time. By the end of the night, his reply read like this: "Thank you all. I never expected this response. This was a personal project that I thought might help one person. Maybe it can help more. I'll be uploading full schematics and code as soon as I polish it a bit more. Anyone who wants to contribute, your ideas are welcome. I'm not an expert. Just someone who never stopped believing that a little movement is better than none at all." He hit send. Closed the lid. Sat back in the dim light and smiled to himself. Then, slowly, quietly, he let out a laugh. A real one. Full of disbelief and release. "Susan," he whispered into the stillness, "you wouldn't believe what just happened." He looked at the old photo of her on the shelf, her standing on the beach, wind in her hair, that knowing smile on her face. The same smile she'd give him every time he started a project and doubted himself halfway through. She used to say, "Finish it. Even if it's ugly. Even if it doesn't work. You finish it because the act of finishing is what gives you back your name." He'd forgotten that. Until now. The next morning, the sun found him in the same clothes, still at the bench, scribbling wiring diagrams with one hand and clicking through open-source files with the other. He'd found an article about adaptive gloves built with modular sockets to swap parts depending on the user's need. It gave him ideas. Lots of them. He didn't even hear the knock at the door at first. The second knock was louder, and he shuffled up the basement stairs, brushing sawdust off his shirt. When he opened the door, he blinked. Tommy stood there. Backpack slung over one shoulder, baseball cap turned backwards, chewing a toothpick like he was trying to act casual, but his eyes were curious. "Hey, Mr. W." Frank smiled. "Tommy. You're up early." "I saw your video," Tommy said, stepping onto the porch. "It's all over the tech subreddits. Didn't know you had moves like that." "I barely remembered how to upload it," Frank said, chuckling. "You want to come see it up close?" Tommy nodded. "Yeah. If you don't mind." "I wouldn't have posted it if I didn't want people to see it," Frank said. They headed down to the basement. Tommy looked around like he was stepping into a hidden lab. "This is wild. You've got, like, a whole retrofuturist inventor vibe down here." "I've had all this stuff for years," Frank said, picking up the glove. "Most of it collected dust. Till a few days ago. And now you're trending," Tommy said. "What happened?" Frank paused. He thought of Elon Musk's voice on that broadcast, the line that had echoed in his mind, "It's not about age, it's about acceleration." Then he said simply, "I got tired of sitting still." Tommy watched as Frank powered up the glove. The servo twitched, steady now. The LED blinked once. "You want to try it?" Frank asked. "You can control it with your forearm. Just small contractions. Seriously? Go on. Don't worry. You won't break it. It's already been broken and fixed once this week." Tommy strapped it on, eyes wide, flexed his arm slightly. The glove responded. Slowly, the fingers closed around an old foam ball on the workbench. His face lit up. That's insane. It's crude, Frank admitted. But the muscle signals enough to simulate grip. The goal is to refine it, make it adaptable. Lightweight. Maybe printable in parts. You should get a Neuralink guy to test it, Tommy said. That rehab clinic that sent you the letter. They'd go nuts over this. I might send them the updated prototype, Frank said. Still a few kinks to work out. But yeah. It's getting close. Tommy unstrapped the glove carefully. I've got a 3D printer in my garage. I could help print a few parts, if you're okay with it. I'd be more than okay with it, Frank said, offering a hand. Tommy shook it, firm and real. Cool. Let's build something, he said. That afternoon, they worked together, Frank sketching, Tommy modeling. The basement, once quiet as a tomb, now buzzed with chatter and clicking keys. They debated filament types, ran test prints, reviewed servo specs. Frank realized how long it had been since he'd talked shop with someone who actually listened. Not just nodded, but asked questions. Challenged ideas. Helped refine them. Around sunset, Tommy packed up and gave a quick wave. Back tomorrow? Frank asked. You bet, Tommy said. This is way better than scrolling through crypto memes all day. Frank chuckled. When the door closed, he stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, looking down at the glowing basement. It felt different now. Not just his workshop. But a place where momentum lived. Where second chances hummed through solder lines and silicon. That evening, another email arrived. It was from Rebecca. 2 words in the subject line, keep going. The body was simple, I watched the video. I remember the science fair. I'm proud of you, Dad. Frank closed his eyes and let the weight of it settle in. Not because it hurt. But because it healed. Some wounds don't need bandages. Just acknowledgement. He typed back, let me know when you're ready. I'd love to show you in person. He hit send. Then he looked down at his hand, the one that had trembled with uncertainty just a few days earlier. The one that had built, repaired, soldered, lifted. The one that had learned, finally, to move again. Not just physically. But toward something. Toward someone. Toward the sound of life still happening. He whispered the line again, quietly to himself, but with belief this time, it's not about age. It's about acceleration. And Frank Whitaker, father, maker, survivor, was finally picking up speed. Frank Whitaker sat at the edge of his workbench late into the night, the garage light casting long shadows across cluttered tools, soldering iron, and scattered components. The glove lay in pieces before him, the wrist-mounted module, the flex sensor, microcontroller board, wiring harness, servo bracket. Each part felt fragile, precious, as if it carried more hope than plastic and copper ought to. Outside, the wind rustled through the eaves, but inside, everything felt electric. He rounded off a joint on the wiring, checked continuity with a multimeter, then soldered the connection and took a breath that trembled with anticipation. He powered on the system. The familiar green LED blinked. The servo stayed silent as before. But today, he was prepared. He adjusted the signal threshold, increased the amplifier gain by a fraction, recalibrated the feedback loop. Fingers closed, streamed code. He flexed and watched. The servo hesitated, then moved. Slow, deliberate, like a hand waking after years of sleep. Frank stared, heart pounding against his ribs. Not a twitch, not a blink, it moved with purpose. He exhaled, the breath shaking out of him. The glove responded. It was real. He grinned, head tilted back, silently cursing and laughing all at once. This wasn't just a machine working. This was evidence. Proof that reclaiming something long lost was still possible. A knock sounded at the open garage door. It was Tommy, smiling shyly with a fresh spool of filament and a handful of printed sensor mounts. They'd agreed to meet tonight at midnight, work odd hours, chase odd dreams. You had me at first sparks, Tommy said, leaning over the bench to inspect the glove. He watched with fascination as Frank flexed his forearm and the fingers of the glove responded again, this time smoother, more confident. That's beautiful, Tommy whispered. That's hope. Frank nodded, voice catching. It's not perfect yet. But it's moving. Tommy laid the new sensor holder next to the prototype wrist piece. I made these in PLA with a flexible filament. Easier on the skin and lighter weight. Thought you might want to test. Frank's eyes dimmed with gratitude. Touches matter, even in small ways. He mixed epoxy on a scrap of cardboard, smoothed it onto the new mount, then gently snapped it into place. The fit was snug, seamless. He admired the joint, it looked ready for the next test. They worked into the early morning, testing, adjusting, retesting. When they finally stepped outside, the sky was pale with first light. In a strange way, it felt like the whole world had been waiting too, for this moment of waking. Tommy slipped his hand into the glove, flipped the switch, flexed. The fingers curled around the foam ball. He grinned at Frank. That's the best thing I've ever seen. Frank shook his head, wiping sweat and solder residue from his forehead. Not yet. But inside, he felt set ablaze. Back inside, Frank sat at the edge of his recliner, finally home, finally still, and warmed his hands with a mug of coffee. He opened his email. 3 new messages. One from the rehab therapist, I'd love to schedule a demonstration for next week. One from a caregiver, my wife has multiple sclerosis. This device could help her. And one from a stranger in Kansas, can we get kits for our makerspace? Frank stared at the screen. Each message was a thread, connections reaching out. He typed replies, yes, let's meet. Tell me what your needs are. I'll share code. How can I help? Then something else pulled his eye down the page. An email from Reddit. A reply to his thread from the elderly woman tinkering with Raspberry Pi projects. She wrote, I took it slow. I never thought I could. But I did. And now I'm building an assistive lamp for my neighbor's night blindness. All because you moved that hand. Thank you. Frank read it 3 times. Sentences blurred. He closed his eyes. Not proud. Not smug. Just, touched. You did that, he whispered, voice thick. He pressed back against the leather chair, thinking of Susan's words, finish it. Even if it's ugly. Even if it doesn't work. This was the result of finishing. Not for himself. For others. The day unfolded around him. He showered, dressed, then walked out to the garage. The glove sat on the bench, still powered, still waiting. Reaching for it felt like greeting an old friend. He grabbed it and nodded. Today would be the first public demo. Later, he packed it into a case with spare components, tools, and printed parts. He wove in the kid's redesigned sensor housing, the 3D printed wrist cuff, his own soldering kit spares. By afternoon, he stood in the narrow hallway of the local rehab clinic, which looked like any unremarkable office, but inside hums of activity pulsed, therapists working with patients, tape playing softly on monitors. He was early. He watched. A man with a cane hobbled past. A woman in a wheelchair rolled quietly. Some looked at him curiously, the aging tinkerer with a toolbox. The waiting filled him with an ache, not old guilt, but the echo of fear that said, what if it doesn't do what you say? What if they expect too much? He set up on a table, cleared space, arranged parts. The therapist, Ms. Alvarez, arrived and greeted him with professional warmth and a soft optimism he recognized from his daughter's smile. This isn't fear. It's possibility. They exchanged greetings. He unpacked tools, she laid out patient files. They picked names. The first patient, Joseph, the man from the photo, stepped forward. He was in his 70s, steady on his feet but cautious. His eyes held the same kindness. Frank kept his voice calm. "Mr. Jones, I brought something I built. Would you like to try it?" Joseph nodded. Frank slid the glove gently onto his hand. It fit better than expected, molding around his fingers, light, pliable. He turned it on. Joseph wiggled a finger. Nothing. He clenched. The glove's hand slowly closed. Joseph's eyes widened, breath caught. I felt that." Frank nearly lost composure. But he steadied himself. "It's okay. Here, try again." Softly, gently, Joseph flexed, and the glove responded in kind, gripping. Tears brimmed in Joseph's eyes. "I've not had this feeling in years." Silence stretched, full of meaning. Then Ms. Alvarez gently cleared her throat. Frank exhaled. The moment hadn't broken him. It had made him. She encouraged more patients to follow. One by one, they strapped on the glove. One by one, the fingers responded. Some wept. Some laughed softly. Some steeled themselves to do small tasks, picking up a pen, gripping a fork, squeezing a stress ball. And with each success, Frank felt something shift inside him, not arrogance, not triumph, but a humble, deep joy. He realized he'd built more than hardware. He'd built connection. Across gaps time had widened, across bodies aging or failing. It wasn't perfect yet. It would never be flawless. But it worked. It soothed. It gave someone a moment of ability they thought was gone. Afterwards, Ms. Alvarez asked to speak privately. "Mr. Whitaker, this is incredible. Could you collaborate with us? We could work on 3D molds, ergonomic design, maybe pilot trials." She smiled. "Genuinely. You want to help people. That's rare." Frank nodded, words lodged in his throat. He walked out into bright afternoon light, weight of meaning pressing him. Weakness had become service. Regret had turned to purpose. He breathed deep. Everything else, the missed years, the breakdowns, didn't vanish. But they no longer defined him. Someone stood there waiting, Tommy. Grinning wide. "You did it," Tommy said. Not a question. An affirmation. "We did it," Frank corrected, quiet, steady. They loaded parts back into the car together, wordless trust between them. That night, Frank sat alone late with the glove resting gently on his lap. He stared at it, the device that had taken him from inert to intentional. His email pinged again. More replies. Invitations. Gratitude. A slow cascade. He typed one response at a time, "I can send you the STL files. Let me know your constraints. Keep me posted." With each message sent, he felt stitches closing, not old cracks, but new seams of the story he was building. He looked at the empty clutch of sticky notes on the wall behind him: order actuator, refine code, find better sensors, reach out to daughter. He replaced that last with a new one, handwritten in blue ink: today moved more hands than I expected. Let tomorrow move more. He smiled. Tired. Glowing. Awake. And finally, at last, without ornament or apology, he whispered. "This is still beginning." Frank Whitaker stared at the ceiling of his basement workshop as dusk settled in, but sleep refused to come. His mind raced with the messages that had arrived earlier, dozens of responses to his forum post, the clinic's request, the flight of small but powerful invitations flying toward him. Outside, streetlights blinked on. Somewhere up above, a radio murmured old jazz. Down here, wires waited like silent confidants. He sat up, rigid but alert, and flipped on the lamp. The glove lay to the side of his bench, still powered. He reached out and flexed the fingers. They bent slightly, responding like cheap old electric toys brought back to life. He smiled, heart hammering. The ache in his chest had turned to something else, anticipation. He opened his laptop to check messages again. One email stood out, subject line, "Video of your glove trending," and his breath caught. He hadn't expected attention to spread this fast, especially not across national borders. He clicked it open. A healthcare reporter from a national publication had seen his video and wanted an interview. She wrote, "Your work is an inspiration. I'd like to tell your story to older Americans who feel invisible. You've given them permission, maybe even urgency, to matter again." Frank sat back, stunned. He reread the words until they sank in. Silence filled the basement, heavy, invitational, electric. He printed a note, "This isn't for me. It's for anyone who still remembers how to hope." He taped it over the bench where he'd drawn his plans. Then he took a deep breath and wrote back, "I would be honored. Let's talk." The next morning, he woke before the roosters. Coffee in hand, he descended the stairs like a pilgrim returning home. He didn't know if an interview would do anything, maybe he'd be depicted as a quirky relic trying to keep up, but Susan's voice echoed in his memory, "Tell the story because someone needs it." He opened the computer and began drafting answers, why he started again, what this meant for people his age, how stubbornness can be a lifeline. Then came a ping. A message on the forum, this one from the elderly woman experimenting with Raspberry Pi and assistive lamps. "Just built the base of the lamp tonight," she wrote. "Printed your mount and soldered the switch. It's ugly. But my neighbor flicks it on now, independent for the first time in years." Frank's chest clenched. The contours of age, of decline, of worn-out dreams, they softened in that moment. He typed, "That's beautiful. Keep building. Keep living." Behind the keyboard, he realized something hadn't moved yet. His daughter. The small connection she offered felt fragile. "Proud of you," she wrote. No guilt. No pressure. Just acknowledgement. And in that acknowledgement, he'd found something more valuable than forgiveness. A reason. A heartbeat of reconnection that pulsed through him, guiding each command sent to the glove's servo. Each strand of code became a bridge, not to another person, but to a conversation. He paused, staring at the machine before him. The circuits hum with possibility. Midday, the phone rang. It was the therapist, Ms. Alvarez, warm and expectant. "We've scheduled a demonstration next week," she said. "Maybe two. After the first, the clinic director wants to meet you. They're talking about presenting at the State Rehab Symposium." Rehab Symposium. For someone who had stopped dreaming, that word felt like a calling card from a life he'd left behind. He agreed, voice steady. Hung up and stared at the receiver. The rest of the day passed in a daze of planning and low-level excitement. He calmed himself with small tasks, cleaning the workbench, polishing wires, assembling spare sensors. At one point, he looked up. Tiny sticky notes fluttered on the wall, refine glove grip, order better EMG, check battery life, reply to clinic. Under them, a new note, invite others to matter. He paused at that. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about him. It was about the army of people watching, on forums, in rehab centers, in lonely homes where decline felt permanent. The elderly tinkering in quiet garages. The forgotten fathers, the sidelined mothers, the retired teachers whose hands shook but whose ideas still burned. He realized his job wasn't just to build a glove. It was to build a spark. That evening, after a shaky Zoom chat with his editor, he backed out of the call and exhaled deeply. He whispered across the table, "What if the spark spreads?" The glove responded, flicking its LED. He laughed aloud, surprise and gratitude mixing like spark and solder. He didn't cook. Instead, he walked outside under stars older than he felt. A few neighbors waved. A cat meowed. Life, no ceremonies, simply continued. He returned inside, drawn to the basement like a moth to low-voltage illumination. Tonight, he didn't code. He just sat, cupping the glove in his hand. He thought of the journalist's words, "Give them permission," and wondered if that could ever be enough. He penned one final sticky note, "I am still here. And so are you." He taped it inside the plastic frame of the glove housing, nearly invisible. Tomorrow, someone might find it. Maybe someone who needs that small confession. Jeff, the tech reporter, would darken his door soon. Clinic trials would commence. His daughter might visit. But for now, he'd rest, knowing he still mattered. Enough to move a finger. Enough to change a future. And in that silent workshop, illuminated not just by LED and hope, Frank Whitaker discovered that being watched didn't mean being finished. It meant being seen. Frank Whitaker sat in the basement at dawn, the dim glow of a single bulb illuminating the glove and scattered tools on the workbench. Sleep had come late and only as fractured dreams, the excitement of the clinic's earlier sessions and the stream of emails flooding his inbox weaving their way into every corner of his mind. Today, he'd added 2 more sticky notes to the bench rim, "Order stronger springs, refine calibration algorithm," yet beneath them pulsed another message he hadn't written, "Am I doing too much?" That question hovered, unspoken, heavy. The knocks began just as he was cleaning the sensor leads. First a quiet tap, then another. He opened the door to find Dr. Alvarez standing in the hallway, sunlight filtering through her glasses. She hesitated, a clipboard in hand. "Mr. Whitaker," she asked gently. Frank nodded, stepping aside. "Do you have a moment to talk upstairs?" He followed her into the waiting room. There, behind the glass door, the therapy area bustled with patients and caregivers. The air was warm with rising voices, life in motion. Dr. Alvarez led him to a small conference nook. She took a breath before speaking, pulling out a note. "First," she said, voice steady, "you did something rare. You reminded people they're not invisible." The clinic director noticed. Frank's throat tightened. "But," she continued, placing a hand softly on her chest, "there's been pushback, from regulatory staff and some families. Concerns around safety, inconsistent performance, even ageism." Frank blinked. "Ageism?" She nodded. "They phrase it politely. Is it too ambitious? Shouldn't this be handled in corporate labs, not garages? Some worry the integrity of the trials could be compromised by unpredictable amateur innovation." He closed his eyes. Amateur. He touched the sticky note that said "Invite others to matter." That was intention, not ego. But even good intentions meet friction. Dr. Alvarez took a folded paper from her clipboard. It was a letter, formally worded, polite, firm. It asked for more data, documentation, liability clarity, an ethics review. Essentially, stop until they vet every screw. Frank opened his mouth. She held up a finger. "I agree, it's frustrating. This thing saved our clients from despair, even a few tears of joy." She paused. "But this world moves slowly, and sometimes out of fear. That fear, of machines and aging hands, of new ideas and old men, throbbed around him." He returned to the basement after the meeting, stepping into the silence heavy with recalibration. He gingerly touched the glove. The servo stirred faintly. He flexed. It responded. But now the movement felt guarded. "Am I overreaching?" he whispered to the circuits. He remembered Elon Musk's words on the broadcast, "The only real limit is the one you stop fighting." But also, he'd said, blind sight, speech restoration, vision implants, technology is not just a toy. It's a responsibility. Frank exhaled, steeling himself. He opened his notebook, found his own scribbled draft of the speech restoration FDA breakthrough designation news. He'd saved the article months ago, dated May 1, 2025, for proof that innovation could come from margin, not just the center. He typed a draft email to the clinic board. I understand and respect the protocols. I'm happy to document, log, present code, anything. But I also believe that people shouldn't wait. Especially not when they're feeling unseen, unheard, or forgotten. Still, his fingers hovered before sending. Upstairs, he heard a wheelchair roll by, soft. He remembered the patient whose hand he'd felt rise again. The glove had moved more than a mechanism. It had moved hope. He replaced the sticky note, "Don't stop fighting." He sighed, then typed, subject, documentation and collaboration, and opened a new page, blank. He didn't know what to say yet. What to promise. The knock came again, louder. This time it was Tommy at the basement door, carrying 2 cups of lukewarm coffee. Frank accepted one, chest tight with unformed gratitude. Tommy's eyes flicked to the bench. "You look like you wrestled with ghosts." Frank offered a half-smile. "More like my own expectations." "Tommy, Saturday, resistance sucks," he said. "But sometimes it means you're doing something real." Frank looked at him, steady, present, neither a stranger nor a witness to his failures. "I don't want to get it pulled," Frank admitted. "But I don't want to make people wait either." Tommy nodded slowly. "How about this, we do this right. Build the data. Build the trust. And keep building anyway." Frank stared at the glove. It glowed softly. He realized that it had always been more than parts. It was dialogue. Between past and future. Between a man and his daughter. Between someone's despair and the spark of movement. That's why resistance stings. Because it's a sign something matters. He leaned forward, picking up the multimeter. "Okay." He closed his eyes. "Let's document everything. Calibrations, failure rates, timing. Let's plan a formal test protocol." Tommy nodded, sliding a refill into the glove socket and lining up wire diagrams on the bench. Frank's breath steadied. He checked his email. A new message, from Audrey Cruz. She typed, "Mr. Whitaker, I wrote my name on the screen today. After 20 years, I wrote again. Thank you for moving your hand." There was nothing else. Just that. He leaned his head against his hand, tears leaking forward. Not for validation, for connection. For knowing that a movement small by design had become immense by human measure. He wouldn't stop fighting. Not for his daughter, not for strangers typing in dark rooms, not for the woman signing her name again. Not for himself. Resistance, he realized, was part of the rhythm. Like the hum of the servo, the pulse of the LED, the flicker of courage in an aging heart. And rising again was worth every challenge. He tapped out a reply to Audrey, "I don't know how much spark I have left. But I promise to keep moving." He hit send. Upstairs, the house remained quiet, but he felt momentum in its walls. He looked at the glove, the notes, the wiring labyrinth. It wasn't going away. And neither was he. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank Whitaker sat at his kitchen table, the morning light spilling softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow on the stack of papers before him. His fingers traced the edges of the official-looking envelope he had just pulled from the mailbox, a letter embossed with the clinic's logo and stamped with the words, "Confidential." His heart thudded with a mix of hope and apprehension. For weeks, the resistance had lingered like a shadow, the demand for documentation, the cautious hesitations from regulators and family members alike. But now, this letter was different. It wasn't a rejection. It was an invitation. They wanted him to present. Not just anywhere, but at the upcoming State Rehabilitation Symposium. The same symposium where some of the country's leading therapists, researchers, and medical device innovators gathered to share breakthroughs and ideas. Frank read the words again and again. We believe your work represents a promising new direction in assistive technology for older adults. We invite you to share your journey and your device with the community. He set the letter down, his eyes scanning the modest kitchen that had witnessed decades of dinners, laughter, and, more recently, long silences. The faded wallpaper, the chipped wooden chair where his daughter used to sit when she was small, the worn countertop where his wife used to bake bread, they all felt part of this moment. A chance not just to show what he'd built, but to reclaim something lost: relevance, connection, purpose. He remembered Elon Musk's words echoing in his mind from that viral interview he'd watched months ago: if you want to change the future, you have to make your move even when everyone else doubts you. And here was his move. Frank allowed himself a small smile, then reached for his notebook. He began drafting his talk. Not just the technical details of the glove, but the story behind it, the frustration of fading independence, the sting of being dismissed because of age, the stubborn refusal to give up. He wrote of the women and men he'd met in the clinic, their battles, their quiet triumphs, and the spark that connected them all. For hours, he refined his words, weaving in quotes from Elon's speeches about innovation and the courage to break molds. When he finished, he read the draft aloud. His voice trembled slightly, but it held a steady rhythm of hope and conviction. I was never too old, he read, to reclaim my purpose. I was never too broken to build a better future. Outside, the morning breeze fluttered the curtains like a whispered affirmation. Days passed as Frank prepared, polishing the glove, ensuring every sensor was calibrated, every wire securely soldered. Tommy stopped by regularly, helping with presentations and offering quiet encouragement. Their conversations were less about technology now and more about legacy, about how the simplest act of moving a finger could ripple into the lives of strangers who felt invisible. The morning of the symposium arrived with a sky so blue it seemed painted. Frank dressed carefully in his best shirt, the one his daughter had gifted him last Christmas. At the clinic, the director greeted him warmly, her eyes reflecting pride and a hint of surprise. You've come a long way, she said. The symposium hall buzzed with energy, bright lights, banners, and crowds of people. Frank felt the familiar surge of anxiety, but also a strange thrill. Here, he was no longer the forgotten old man tinkering alone in a basement. Here, he was a storyteller, an innovator, a beacon. When it was his turn, he stepped onto the stage, the glove strapped carefully on his right hand. The room quieted, and Frank began to speak. He told them about loss and resilience, about how age had tried to define him, and how he refused to let it. As he flexed the glove, demonstrating its responsiveness, he saw nods and smiles. Questions followed, technical, skeptical, hopeful. But none were dismissive. After the talk, a young therapist approached him, eyes shining. My mother struggles with grip weakness, she said. Your work gives me hope. Could we collaborate? Frank's heart swelled. At that moment, he realized the true power of his journey, not just the device, but the connections it forged. On the drive home, the sunset painted the sky in fiery oranges and pinks. Frank felt a lightness, a sense of being part of something bigger. When he pulled into his driveway, his phone buzzed with a new message, from his daughter. Proud of you, Dad. Can't wait to hear all about it. He smiled, typing back, it's only the beginning. That night, as he lay in bed, the glow of the glove's LED resting on his bedside table, Frank whispered into the darkness, we're just getting started. And somewhere deep inside, he knew it was true. Frank Whitaker sat alone in his living room, the late afternoon sun filtering through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the worn carpet. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the heating unit and the occasional creak of settling wood. He stared at the phone in his hands, his thumb hovering over the screen, hesitating. It was a message from his daughter, Emily. "Dinner Thursday? I want to hear about the symposium." The simple invitation carried a weight Frank hadn't felt in years, a tentative thread stretched across the distance between two hearts strained by silence and years of unspoken regrets. He remembered the last time they had spoken face to face, a brief, awkward conversation 3 Christmases ago, when Emily had just left college and he was lost in his workshop, too stubborn to reach out. The memory was bittersweet, her frustration mingling with his guilt. Now, he felt a surge of determination. He typed back, "I'd like that." The days until Thursday passed slowly. Frank kept busy with glove improvements and emails, but the invitation lingered in his mind like a quiet promise. On Wednesday night, he found himself digging through old photo albums. Pictures of Emily as a toddler, smiling with scraped knees and sparkling eyes. He traced a finger over a faded image of her handing him a drawing titled, "Best Dad." A tear slipped down his cheek. This wasn't just about technology or public recognition. It was about rebuilding what time had worn thin. Thursday arrived crisp and clear. Frank dressed carefully, choosing the shirt he'd worn to the symposium and a light jacket that had belonged to his wife. The restaurant was cozy, a small place Emily liked for its homemade pies and friendly waitstaff. When Frank entered, he spotted her immediately, older now, but with the same spark in her eyes, the same hesitant smile. She stood and embraced him briefly, a fragile bridge forming in that moment. Over coffee and pie, they talked, not just about the glove or the symposium, but about life, dreams deferred, fears shared. Emily spoke of her struggles balancing work and family, her fears of losing her own parents. Frank listened, sometimes offering gentle words, other times simply holding space for her voice. At one point, she reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. Frank's chest tightened. "I'm proud of you, too," he replied. The conversation felt like a bomb, stitching together years of distance. As the evening wore on, Frank shared stories from the symposium, the questions, the collaborations, the faces of people who'd found hope in his work. Emily smiled, eyes shining. "You're changing things," she said. "Not just with the glove, but with how you live." After dinner, they walked slowly through the quiet neighborhood, memories and new beginnings mingling in the cool air. Frank realized that while technology had been his spark, connection was his true power. Rebuilding bridges wasn't easy, but it was possible. Back home, Frank placed a photo of Emily and himself on the mantel, a symbol of the journey ahead. He glanced at the glove resting on the table, then at the framed picture, and whispered, "This is for us." The night settled around him, peaceful and full of promise. The conference room at the State Rehabilitation Clinic was colder than Frank Whitaker expected, the sterile walls echoing the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. He stood near the doorway, clutching his worn leather briefcase, the contents of which felt more like hope than hardware. Today was the scheduled review meeting, an official gathering of administrators, medical professionals, and regulatory advisors. The purpose: to evaluate Frank's project, the assistive glove he had painstakingly built and refined over the past months. The room was already half full when Frank entered, the attendees engaged in quiet conversations that stopped abruptly as he approached. Dr. Alvarez, who had supported his work from the beginning, greeted him with a nod and a reassuring smile. "Ready?" she asked softly. Frank swallowed his nervousness. "As I'll ever be." The meeting began with a presentation by the head of the Clinical Trials Department, who outlined the protocol for evaluating new assistive technologies. As the discussion shifted toward Frank's glove, skepticism seeped through the room like cold fog. One of the senior administrators, a stern man named Dr. Halvorsen, spoke first. "While the enthusiasm is commendable," he said, "we must remember this is an unproven device developed outside formal institutional frameworks. The risk of unintended consequences, especially in older patients, cannot be overlooked. Frank felt the weight of the room's gaze, the unspoken doubt pressing against him like a physical force. He cleared his throat and stepped forward. I understand the concerns. Safety is paramount. That's why I've meticulously documented every calibration, every failure mode, and every success. The glove has restored movement to patients who were told nothing could help. He gestured toward the data charts projected on the screen behind him. For example, Audrey Cruz, who hasn't written in 20 years, can now sign her name again. That's not just a statistic. It's a life restored. A murmur rippled through the room. Another member, a clinical therapist named Denise, leaned forward. I've seen Mr. Whitaker's device in action. The precision and responsiveness are impressive, and patients respond well. But we need rigorous, controlled trials before we consider wide adoption. Frank nodded. Absolutely. I'm eager to collaborate with the clinic's research team to design those trials and meet regulatory standards. The conversation grew tense as questions sharpened. What about liability? How would the glove be maintained? Was there a risk of injury? Could the technology be adapted for different conditions? Frank answered each honestly, acknowledging limitations but emphasizing the potential to improve lives. At one point, Dr. Halvorsen challenged, isn't it reckless to put hope before safety? Frank paused. It's reckless not to try. To leave people waiting, forgotten. To tell them their bodies are too old, their time past. This glove is a tool, not a cure-all, but a step forward. And every step starts with someone willing to walk into the unknown. The room was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, a shift. Dr. Alvarez stood. I propose we approve a pilot program, small scale, monitored closely, with Mr. Whitaker leading development and collaborating with our clinical researchers. A few heads nodded. The director of the clinic, a woman with a sharp gaze and no-nonsense demeanor, added, this project has potential. Let's see it rigorously tested. But no shortcuts. The meeting adjourned with cautious optimism, and Frank felt a surge of relief. Outside, as he stepped into the sunlight, a reporter from a local paper approached. Mr. Whitaker, can I get a comment? What does this mean for older Americans? Frank smiled, tired but determined. It means hope is never out of reach. It means innovation isn't just for the young. It means we can rewrite what aging looks like. That evening, he sat at his desk, eyes reflecting the soft glow of the computer screen. Emails poured in, messages of support, offers to help, some skeptical but curious inquiries. He began drafting the pilot program's outline, a blueprint for rigorous testing and real-world impact. Yet beneath the professional triumph simmered the deeper challenge, changing minds hardened by years of skepticism, overcoming the invisible walls age builds around the willing heart. He thought again of Elon Musk's fearless defiance of limits, his insistence on pushing boundaries. Frank whispered to the empty room, it's not about proving them wrong. It's about proving ourselves right. And with that, he turned back to his work, ready to face the doubters head-on. Frank Whitaker's basement workshop had transformed into a hive of activity, buzzing with the energy of progress and cautious optimism. The hum of soldering irons, the rhythmic tapping of keyboards, and the quiet murmur of conversations filled the air as volunteers, clinicians, and a few curious neighbors gathered around the workbench. It was a small miracle to see so many people drawn to one man's dream, a glove that could move fingers, spark hope, and rewrite the story of aging. The pilot program had officially launched, sanctioned by the clinic, and Frank found himself at the center of a growing community united by purpose. But amid the technical breakthroughs and steady improvements lurked the fragile pulse of uncertainty. Could this really change lives? Was this just a fleeting moment, or the beginning of something lasting? One evening, after a long day of fitting new prototypes and troubleshooting sensor glitches, Frank sat alone, gazing at the glove resting on the bench. The LED blinked steadily, a beacon in the dim light. He reached out and flexed the fingers, feeling the familiar mechanical response, a dance between man and machine. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Audrey Cruz. "I wrote my name again today. It felt like the first time all over. Thank you." Frank's throat tightened. Moments like this were the true currency of his work. Hope made tangible. Over the next few weeks, word spread. Local news picked up the story of the miracle glove that helped restore movement in patients once considered lost causes. Clinics requested demonstrations. Researchers asked for data. Volunteers lined up to help with trials. Frank's modest basement workshop felt like a command center for a quiet revolution. But with growth came challenges. Some patients struggled with the device's complexity. Others faced setbacks that tested their resolve. One afternoon, Frank visited a senior center to demonstrate the glove. He met Margaret, a spirited woman in her 70s whose hands trembled so severely she could barely hold a cup. When Frank fitted the glove, her eyes lit with disbelief as her fingers responded for the first time in years. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "I never thought I'd feel this again," she whispered. "Thank you." Frank's own eyes burned with emotion. This was why he kept pushing, because every flicker of movement was a spark of life rekindled. Yet amid these triumphs, the critics remained. An online forum sparked debates, with some dismissing the glove as a novelty, others worried about safety, and a few accusing Frank of chasing a pipe dream. Frank read the comments late one night, his fingers trembling not from the device but from doubt. He thought of Elon Musk's voice in his mind, "The greatest risk is not taking any risk." With renewed determination, he drafted a response, a blog post titled, "Why We Must Keep Moving." He wrote candidly about fear, failure, and the courage to defy expectations at any age. The post went viral among the older community, sparking conversations across social media. Messages poured in, stories of lost independence, renewed hope, and a shared refusal to be defined by age. One message stood out. A video from a veteran named Jim, flexing his hand with the glove and saying, "I'm not done yet." That video became a rallying cry, a symbol of resilience. Frank felt the spark ignite, not just in the glove, but in the hearts of people who had been told their time was over. One morning, as he prepared for another clinic session, Emily stopped by unexpectedly. "Dad," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I want to help. Teach me." Together, they spent the afternoon calibrating the device, her hands learning the rhythms of the glove. For Frank, this was more than progress, it was healing, a passing of the torch to a new generation. As twilight settled, Frank looked out the basement window, the stars beginning to twinkle. He whispered to the night, "This is just the beginning." The spark was lit, and nothing, not age, doubt, or fear, could extinguish it now. The glow from the workshop's fluorescent lights bathed Frank Whitaker's face as he leaned over his workbench, eyes fixed on the intricate circuitry of the glove's newest prototype. Months of testing had refined the device, but Frank knew that progress was a journey, not a destination. Tonight, however, a new problem pressed against his mind like a storm cloud. The clinic's latest report had arrived that afternoon. While many patients showed remarkable improvement, some had experienced unexpected side effects, mild nerve irritation, muscle fatigue, and in one case, a setback that forced temporary suspension from the trial. Frank traced the edges of the document, the clinical language doing little to mask the sting of setbacks. Doubt crept in again, whispering that maybe his age, his lack of formal training, had led him too far. He glanced at the photo of Elon Musk on the corkboard, a reminder of relentless innovation, the refusal to stop despite obstacles. The voice echoed in his head, "Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough." Frank took a deep breath, straightening up. This was the new challenge, the part that would test his resolve more than any technical glitch. The next day, the clinic called for a meeting with the pilot program team. Frank arrived early, his heart pounding with anticipation. The room was filled with doctors, therapists, engineers, and patient advocates, all focused on one thing: how to move forward safely and effectively. Dr. Alvarez opened the session, her tone both encouraging and serious. "We've seen incredible progress, but the risks cannot be ignored. Our priority is patient safety without stifling innovation." Frank nodded, grateful for her balanced approach. The discussion turned to solutions: adjusting the glove's force sensitivity, improving user training, and implementing more frequent monitoring. The engineers proposed software updates to detect early signs of strain, while therapists suggested personalized rehab plans. Frank absorbed every word, feeling both the weight of responsibility and the pulse of possibility. Afterwards, a small group stayed behind, and Frank found himself surrounded by experts eager to collaborate. For the first time, he felt less like a lone inventor and more like a part of a team, united by a shared mission. Over the next weeks, Frank poured himself into redesigning the glove's interface, working closely with Emily and the clinic's engineers. They experimented with softer materials, adaptive feedback, and new algorithms that responded more gently to muscle fatigue. Progress was incremental but tangible. Meanwhile, Frank's public presence grew. Invitations came from senior centers, tech podcasts, and community groups. His story resonated with a generation craving empowerment and connection. Yet amid the acclaim, the setbacks kept him grounded. One afternoon, Frank visited a patient named Harold, a retired carpenter whose hands trembled but spirit remained unbroken. Harold confessed frustration with the glove's adjustments. "I just want to do the simple things again: hold a hammer, carve a bird." Frank listened carefully, promising to refine the glove's responsiveness. Harold's determination reignited Frank's own. He realized that every obstacle was a call to innovate, a chance to listen more deeply to the people this technology was meant to serve. Late one night, Frank sat by his basement window, watching the stars blink like distant promises. He felt the exhaustion of months but also the quiet thrill of a breakthrough waiting on the horizon. Change wasn't easy, especially when age and doubt tried to hold him back, but it was possible. He reached for his journal and wrote, "Every setback is the birthplace of innovation." Folding the page, he looked once more at Elon's photo and whispered, "Onward." The morning sun filtered through the windows of the community center where Frank Whitaker was preparing for a presentation. Today marked a pivotal moment in his journey, the first public demonstration of his refined assistive glove in front of an audience of skeptics, supporters, and potential partners. The room was buzzing with quiet anticipation as local officials, medical professionals, senior citizens, and curious onlookers settled into their seats. Frank adjusted his tie, feeling a familiar mix of nerves and determination. Years ago, he might have shied away from such exposure, doubting his relevance in a world that celebrated youth and rapid innovation. But today, standing in front of this crowd, he felt the steady pulse of purpose beating strong inside him. He began by sharing his story, his regrets, the loneliness, the fears that came with aging. He spoke candidly about the challenges that older Americans faced, from declining mobility to the crushing weight of invisibility. Then he unveiled the glove, its sleek design a testament to tireless hours of trial and error. As Frank demonstrated the glove's capabilities, how it translated nerve signals into precise finger movements, the room grew silent, captivated by the fusion of human spirit and technology. He invited volunteers to try the glove, guiding them patiently as they marveled at the newfound dexterity. Among the audience was Dr. Halvorsen, once a staunch skeptic, now watching intently. After the session, the room erupted in applause, and Frank felt the surge of validation. Yet, as always, the work was just beginning. Outside the community center, Frank met Margaret again. The woman whose trembling hands had first inspired him. She grasped his hand firmly, eyes shining with gratitude. "You're breaking barriers, Frank. Not just with your invention, but with what's possible at our age." Her words echoed the sentiment that had fueled him all along. But the journey was not without friction. Later that week, Frank received a call from a regional health authority questioning the long-term viability of the glove. "We need more data, more proof this isn't a fleeting trend," the voice said bluntly. Frank replied calmly, "I understand. We're committed to rigorous testing and transparency. But every breakthrough starts with a single step." The conversation reminded him that progress was often met with resistance. In his quieter moments, Frank grappled with self-doubt, wondering if his age would forever be a barrier in the fast-moving world of technology. But then he'd recall Elon Musk's words, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Motivated by this, Frank reached out to academic institutions and secured partnerships for clinical trials, eager to build the scientific foundation necessary to move forward. Back in his workshop, Emily helped organize community events where seniors could try the glove, fostering a network of users who shared their stories and provided invaluable feedback. The movement grew, becoming a beacon of empowerment for many who had resigned themselves to limitations. One evening, Frank received a letter from a young engineer named Sarah, inspired by his journey and eager to contribute. Their collaboration breathed fresh energy into the project, blending youthful innovation with seasoned wisdom. Together, they tackled software enhancements and began exploring new applications of the technology. As spring gave way to summer, Frank reflected on how far he had come, from isolation to connection, from doubt to determination. He realized that breaking barriers was not just about technology but about breaking the chains of fear and invisibility that age often imposed. Standing on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Frank whispered, "This is our time." The future was no longer something to fear, it was a frontier waiting to be claimed. The late afternoon light spilled softly through the windows of Frank Whitaker's home, casting a golden glow over the familiar yet somehow fragile space. The house that once felt cavernous with silence now seemed alive, infused with tentative hope. But today, Frank felt the weight of an entirely different challenge. Not one of technology or innovation, but of the heart. Emily was coming over for dinner. It was the first real opportunity in years for them to share an evening without distractions, without the relentless hum of gadgets or the pressures of the pilot program. Frank prepared the meal with careful attention, chopping vegetables and seasoning the chicken with a touch of nostalgia. Memories of family dinners past mingled with the present moment, reminders of love that time had tried to erode but never quite extinguished. When Emily arrived, the initial awkwardness gave way to genuine warmth. They talked about the symposium, the clinic's progress, and the relentless pursuit of something better for their community. But then the conversation shifted, becoming quieter, more vulnerable. Emily hesitated before asking, "Dad, do you ever think about Mom?" Frank paused, the knife hovering midair. The question opened a door he had kept closed for years. Every day, he admitted. She was the heart of this family. He spoke of their life together, the dreams they shared, the hardships they endured, and the silence that followed her passing. Emily listened, her eyes moist but steady. "I missed her too," she said softly. "And I missed you." The words hung in the air like a fragile bridge spanning years of distance. They shared stories of grief, resilience, and the longing to reclaim what was lost. For the first time, Frank felt the tight knot of regret begin to loosen, replaced by the possibility of healing. Later, as they moved to the living room, Emily pulled out an old photo album. Together, they flipped through pages yellowed by time, weddings, birthdays, vacations, each image a testament to a life once full and vibrant. Frank marveled at how memory could both wound and heal, how it tethered them to the past while nudging them forward. The night deepened, and they spoke of the future, not as a distant dream but as a shared journey. Emily revealed her plans to start a nonprofit supporting aging adults with disabilities, inspired by her father's work. Frank smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "You're carrying the torch," he said. "And I couldn't be more grateful." As the evening wound down, Frank realized that the greatest breakthrough was not in circuitry or code but in reconnecting with the people who mattered most. He thought of Elon Musk's audacity, not just to change technology but to challenge what it means to live fully at any age. Sitting quietly, Frank whispered, "This is what matters. This is why we keep moving." Outside, the stars shimmered like promises. Inside, 2 generations found a new rhythm, one of love, forgiveness, and unspoken strength. The crossroads of the heart was no longer a place of fear but a gateway to belonging. Spring had fully blossomed, and with it came a sense of renewed energy that pulsed through Frank Whitaker's world like an unstoppable tide. The Assistive Glove Project, once a solitary dream born in a dim basement, was now a movement gaining traction across communities and clinics far beyond the small town where it began. Frank found himself traveling more frequently, visiting rehabilitation centers, speaking at conferences, and meeting with potential partners eager to bring the technology to those who needed it most. Each trip reminded him that the challenge wasn't just engineering, it was about creating a network of belief and support that defied the loneliness so many older adults faced. One morning, after an invigorating breakfast at a local diner, Frank sat in the back of a car en route to a major medical conference in Chicago. The city skyline appeared on the horizon, sharp against a brilliant blue sky. The event promised to be the most significant yet, an opportunity to present the glove to leading neurologists, tech innovators, and health policymakers. The stakes were high, and Frank's nerves fluttered with a familiar mix of excitement and self-doubt. "You ready?" Emily asked from the passenger seat, offering a reassuring smile. Frank nodded, feeling the steadying power of her presence. The conference hall buzzed with activity when they arrived, crowds of people moving between booths, exchanging ideas, and sharing breakthroughs. Frank's booth was modest but drew a steady stream of visitors curious about the glove's potential. During his presentation, he spoke not only about the technology but about the human stories behind it, the lives transformed, the independence regained, and the hope reignited. Audience members listened intently, some wiping tears as they heard testimonials from patients like Audrey and Harold. Questions followed, probing the science and the feasibility of scaling the project. Frank answered with transparency and passion, bridging the gap between inventor and advocate. Afterwards, an unexpected invitation came from a representative of a major tech foundation interested in funding expanded clinical trials. The validation was exhilarating. Yet amid the external momentum, Frank remained grounded by the everyday realities. Back home, he continued to refine the glove, incorporating feedback from users and clinicians. Emily's nonprofit took shape, organizing workshops and support groups that created a sense of community for older adults facing physical challenges. One afternoon, Frank received a call from Jim, the veteran who had inspired many with his viral video. Jim was organizing a grassroots campaign to raise awareness about aging and technology. "Frank," he said, voice thick with emotion, "your work is giving people like me a reason to fight. Let's make sure no one feels invisible." That same week, a feature story about Frank and the glove appeared in a national magazine, shining a spotlight on the intersection of innovation and aging. The response was overwhelming. Letters, emails, and social media messages poured in from all corners of the country. Frank read each one, feeling a profound connection to a community that stretched far beyond his immediate world. Yet despite the surge of success, he never lost sight of the mission's deeper purpose. One evening, as he walked through the neighborhood park, he paused to watch a group of seniors practicing Tai Chi beneath the cherry blossoms. The scene was a quiet testament to resilience, a reminder that strength often came in subtle, steady movements. Frank reflected on his own journey, the moments of doubt, the breakthroughs, the relationships rekindled. He realized that momentum wasn't just about progress in technology, it was about the ripple effect of hope and determination across lives. Inspired, Frank returned home and opened his journal, writing, "Momentum is the collective heartbeat of change. When we move together, age becomes a new frontier, not a barrier." As night fell, the stars twinkled with the promise of possibility. Frank knew the road ahead would still have obstacles, but the fire that had been sparked was now ablaze, one that could illuminate the future for generations to come. The hum of activity in the clinic's conference room was unusually high-pitched that morning, with voices buzzing about breakthroughs and setbacks, deadlines and breakthroughs. Frank Whitaker sat quietly at the edge of the table, observing the group with a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The assistive glove had come far, but new challenges demanded fresh perspectives. As the team reviewed the latest test results, a new face entered the room, Dr. Lillian Kim, a neuroscientist from a prestigious university who had recently expressed interest in collaborating. Frank had heard of her reputation: brilliant, driven, and unafraid to challenge conventions. Her presence was a breath of fresh air. Lillian spoke with a calm authority, immediately diving into the data and offering insights that cut through the noise. "We need to understand not just the mechanics but the brain's adaptation to the device," she said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Neuroplasticity is key here. How the brain rewires itself in response to new stimuli." Frank felt a surge of excitement. This was exactly the kind of expertise the project needed to move beyond incremental improvements. Over the following weeks, Lillian and Frank forged an unlikely partnership, blending his practical experience and her scientific rigor. Their conversations stretched long into the evenings, exploring possibilities that neither had imagined alone. Together, they designed experiments to map how patients' brains responded to the glove, hoping to unlock deeper layers of recovery and empowerment. At first, some team members were skeptical: could this academic collaboration really translate into real-world impact? But as preliminary results began to show increased neural connectivity in patients using the glove, the skepticism gave way to cautious optimism. One afternoon, Lillian invited Frank to visit her lab. The sterile space was a stark contrast to his basement workshop, filled with state-of-the-art imaging machines and arrays of computers. Watching the brain scans flicker on screens, Frank was humbled by the complexity of the human mind and inspired by the potential to harness it. "This," Lillian said, "is the frontier where technology meets biology. And you're leading the charge." The partnership breathed new life into the project. They secured a significant research grant that expanded clinical trials and enabled the development of a next-generation glove with enhanced sensory feedback. Frank found himself at the center of a growing coalition: scientists, engineers, therapists, and patients united by a shared vision. Amid the whirlwind, Frank's personal life blossomed too. Emily's nonprofit had grown into a vibrant community hub, offering resources, workshops, and social events that empowered older adults to reclaim their independence. The connection between the family's efforts felt deeply satisfying. Yet the journey was far from over. One day, a setback struck: the new glove prototype malfunctioned during a trial, causing discomfort to a patient. The incident was a harsh reminder of the stakes involved. Frank grappled with feelings of responsibility and doubt, questioning whether the risks outweighed the rewards. In the quiet of his basement, he turned again to Elon Musk's example: the fearless embrace of failure as a necessary step toward success. "If you're not failing," he whispered, "you're not trying hard enough." With renewed resolve, Frank and Lillian led the team through intensive troubleshooting, learning from the incident and implementing safeguards that made the device safer and more intuitive. The experience forged stronger bonds among the team and deepened their commitment. Public interest surged as news of the partnership and advances spread. Frank found himself invited to speak on podcasts and at forums, sharing not just the technical details but the human stories behind the innovation. His message was clear: aging was not a limitation but a catalyst for transformation. One evening, as Frank and Emily walked through a nearby park, they spotted a group of seniors practicing with the glove, their faces alight with determination. Watching them, Frank felt a profound sense of gratitude and possibility. The unexpected ally had arrived, not just in Lillian, but in every person who refused to accept the confines of age. Standing beneath a sky full of stars, Frank whispered, "This is just the beginning." The conference room was packed with an audience that spanned generations, from eager young engineers to seasoned healthcare professionals, all drawn together by a shared curiosity about the future of brain-computer interfaces. Frank Whitaker stood at the podium, the refined assistive glove displayed on the table beside him, its soft lights pulsing faintly under the room's dimmed glow. He scanned the crowd, searching for familiar faces, Emily, Lillian, even a few patients whose lives had been transformed by the technology. Despite the applause that greeted him, Frank's heart pounded with the weight of what he was about to propose, a bold, ambitious plan to expand the project beyond clinical trials and into the everyday lives of millions of older Americans struggling with mobility and independence. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "What if I told you that growing older doesn't mean giving up on your dreams or your ability to live fully? What if technology could unlock new possibilities, even for those who feel left behind?" The room fell silent, the question hanging like a challenge in the air. Frank shared stories, of Audrey, who held her granddaughter's hand again after years of tremors, of Harold, the retired carpenter who carved wooden birds with renewed precision. He spoke not only about the glove's mechanics but about the resilience of the human spirit and the courage it took to try something new at any age. Then came the crux of his proposal, a nationwide initiative to distribute the assistive glove, paired with training programs and community support, aimed at empowering seniors across America. The plan was ambitious, with risks and uncertainties that made even Frank's stomach tighten. But the urgency was clear. "We cannot afford to wait," he said. "Every day without this technology is a day of lost independence, lost connection, lost hope." The presentation sparked a flurry of questions and debate. Funding agencies hesitated, wary of the scale and cost. Some critics doubted whether the technology could truly make a difference outside controlled environments. Frank felt the familiar pull of doubt but refused to yield. Drawing on Elon Musk's ethos, he reminded himself, when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. In the weeks that followed, Frank and Lillian worked tirelessly to refine the proposal, gathering data, securing letters of support, and building a coalition of advocates. They met with policymakers, navigated bureaucracy, and rallied public opinion through heartfelt storytelling and community engagement. Emily's nonprofit became a vital partner, connecting the dots between technology and real-world needs. At home, Frank wrestled with the personal cost of the endeavor, the long hours, the mounting pressure, and the toll on his health. Yet, in quiet moments, he found strength in the memories of those who believed in him and the knowledge that the leap of faith was necessary for meaningful change. One afternoon, a breakthrough arrived in the form of a major grant approval, signaling the green light to launch the expanded program. The news was met with tears of relief and celebration among the team. But Frank knew this was only the beginning of a new set of challenges: implementation, adaptation, and sustaining momentum. As preparations began for the rollout, Frank visited a community center where seniors were receiving training on the glove. He watched as a woman named Gloria tentatively flexed her fingers, then smiled broadly as the device responded seamlessly. The joy on her face was a reminder that innovation was more than technology, it was about restoring dignity and possibility. Later that evening, Frank sat alone on his porch, the weight of the day pressing gently on his shoulders. The sky above was vast and dark, sprinkled with stars that seemed to pulse with silent encouragement. He thought about Elon Musk's journey, his risks, his failures, his relentless drive to reach beyond limits. Frank whispered into the night, "Here's to the leap of faith, the step that changes everything." The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Frank felt ready to embrace it fully. The air was crisp with the promise of early fall as Frank Whitaker stood before a crowd gathered in the town's refurbished auditorium. The same community center where his journey had quietly begun now brimmed with faces bright with anticipation and hope. Reporters clicked cameras, children tugged at their parents' sleeves, and elderly hands clutched programs describing the day's events. Frank's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and humility. He was no longer just an inventor or a dreamer but a symbol of what it meant to defy age, to embrace change, and to create a new legacy. As the ceremony began, Frank's eyes found Emily sitting near the front, her smile steady and warm. She caught his gaze and nodded, a silent affirmation of the path they had walked together, one paved with loss, courage, and unwavering belief. The program opened with stories from users of the assistive glove, people whose lives had been transformed by the technology and the community it fostered. Voices rose, some shaky, others strong, each carrying the weight of renewed possibility. Frank listened, tears threatening behind his eyes, as a woman recounted how she'd been able to hold her grandchild for the first time in years, and a man spoke of returning to painting after decades of frustration. Their testimonies wove a tapestry of resilience that transcended mere invention. When it was Frank's turn, he stepped to the podium with a steady breath, recalling the moment it all changed, the spark that ignited his journey when hope seemed distant and fading. He spoke plainly, his voice rich with emotion and conviction. "I once believed growing old meant stepping back, giving way, and fading into the background. But that was the lie I was telling myself. The truth is, we are never too old to matter, to create, to connect. Age is not a cage but a calling." He shared the story of Elon Musk's fearless mindset, the refusal to accept limits, the courage to challenge the status quo. Elon's example reminded me that the greatest breakthroughs come not from comfort but from risk, from daring to try when the odds seem impossible. The room was silent, hanging on every word. Frank continued, "This glove, this movement, it is not just mine. It belongs to every person who refused to accept too old as an answer. It belongs to every family touched by loss and hope. It belongs to the future we are building together." After the speech, the ceremony flowed into celebrations, and Frank found himself surrounded by hugs, handshakes, and stories. A young volunteer approached, her eyes shining. "You've given me hope for my grandmother," she said softly. "Thank you." Frank smiled, feeling the profound ripple of impact. That night, back at home, Frank sat quietly in his favorite chair, gazing at the photograph of his late wife on the mantel. He whispered, "We did it. This is our legacy." The journey had been long and fraught with doubt, but it had also been filled with moments of profound connection and transformation. Frank realized that the greatest legacy was not the technology itself but the awakening it sparked in hearts and minds. He thought of the countless people whose lives were touched, the barriers broken, and the horizons expanded. The realization brought a peaceful clarity. Frank understood now that the moment it all changed was not a single instant but a continuous unfolding, a series of choices, risks, and acts of courage. He had been waiting for permission to matter again, and in stepping forward, he had given himself that permission. Outside, the night was quiet, the stars steady witnesses to a life redefined. As Frank closed his eyes, a gentle smile crossed his face. "I was never too old," he thought. "I was just waiting to begin." The new legacy was not an end but a beginning, an invitation for others to embrace their own journeys, to break their own barriers, and to believe that the future, no matter the age, is theirs to shape. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?